All right, I'm starting recording.
All right. I know I'm the last talk of the day, keeping you guys from going home, so I'll try to make this as brief and concise as I can, which I think I can do it. A lot of information to take in here, though. Just kind of a disclaimer here, I'll give you, most of you guys know me, but if you do want to get in contact with me, I have 3 different Twitter accounts there. So you can follow me on Twitter, follow our MU Digital Forensics on Twitter, shoot any questions you want to, and if you want to find out anything in terms of stuff we do here at Marshall research-wise, feel free to get in contact with me. I'll put my email and stuff at the end of this presentation, but really kind of want to get into the meat of this presentation, which is really the potentially unwanted programs. And this was a talk that I had done at B-Sides Kansas City last year, kind of a variant of it, but updated a little bit. And had actually met some folks who ended up working on this with, which was kind of cool and kind of moving this forward. So this kind of research has kind of morphed a little bit, and we find that a lot in practice now. But I want to bring up this little document here, or this little slide, for you folks that are really kind of new to InfoSec, to just kind of show the life cycle of a particular hack or a kill chain or something like that, if you want to refer to it as that. But normally, in the potential life cycle of a hacking attempt, you're going to see outside reconnaissance. And if you were here for Tom's presentation when he was using the Discover scripts that Lee had written, a lot of that kind of morphs into these outside and inside reconnaissance tasks that you perform, basically, which comes down to open source intelligence. And that is usually very passive in nature, just figuring out what the layout of your company is. The inside reconnaissance is considering going after certain firewalls, figuring out what the perimeter looks like in a particular network. And many times, if you've worked in InfoSec at all, you'll know stuff like Nmap, Kali tools, and even Discover will allow you to execute those scripts automatically. But normally in that outside reconnaissance, you're getting specific information like network layout, you're pinging ports, you're looking for a way in most cases. After that, you're going to be firing your exploit. Now, this could be, the exploits are a dime a dozen, and we'll talk about one of the exploits here shortly, and we'll break one down. But this is the weakness in the network, and you exploit that. Once you exploit that, you're getting the foothold in the network. So that could be compromised database, whether it be MySQL, PHP, Apache, just a standard Nginx Linux box, something along those lines that you're compromising, and then you're essentially getting to what you call the profit stage, which is where most of your black hat hackers want to end up. They want to be able for these particular mechanisms to be persistent, ultimately leading to installation of ransomware and a prolonged state of ransomware. If it's self-propagating, they want that to propagate through the entire network. This is really not much to do with the presentation, but you notice we put those in threat levels, which is from low, medium to high. So outside reconnaissance, even though it's kind of dangerous, you don't want big footprints out there. Really, in the overall scheme, you're hoping that that next level of inside reconnaissance is going to get blocked, and which is still kind of considered low. I would probably put that into the low to medium range. But if they're firing exploits, that's considered to be medium. Really, where the high threat level goes in is where profit. This is where your files start to become deleted, and you've probably seen in the news a lot of companies are paying out Bitcoin to have their files undeleted, get a hold of those particular keys to undelete or unencrypt the files. That has really nothing to do with it, but it has something to do with the kind of direction that this presentation is going. So here's a couple of things I want to kind of keep in mind. First and foremost, as an attacker, you want to introduce as few moving parts to a network as possible, or at least in the exploit range. The second thing is each piece of software that you add to that in a traditional attempt to break into a network increases the likelihood of detection. because you're looking at tools, you're looking at logs now that are not just searching for hash values and things of that nature, but they're looking at a very heuristic format. So if something kind of sits out of the ordinary, hopefully you have the detection mechanisms, whether it be automated or human, that's going to catch this and block it at some point. So that increases the likelihood of detection, including even your anti-malware, antivirus clients, which don't really catch about 1/10 of really what's out there. That being said, the attackers will pack payloads into what we call these underlying locations and leverage the native tools for execution. And we'll talk about the native tools and executables here shortly and give you a breakdown of those. That leads up to a traditional attack vector, which really utilizes these portable executable installs. And it's really surprising to me, a lot of people that have been in the community for a while, especially in InfoSec and even on digital forensics, don't really understand what native tools and portable executables actually are and why they could be a concern in a particular operating system. So I'll talk about that. The last thing that I want to mention is that the method of attack, at least this method of attack, of using embedded tools, doing in-map scans, it's very, very noisy in nature. If you've ever taken a network forensics class, and that's one of my areas of expertise, you'll find that if you're pinging a network on an in-map scan, it's a really, really noisy process. If you're using a lot of automated mechanisms, it's going to generate a lot of chatter and it's going to throw some errors. And the more noise that a particular hacker can make on the network, there's a better chance even a human mechanism stepping in there and saying, whoa, wait a minute, this web proxy log just does not look right. I even see that from home all the time. In my own home network, I have a squid proxy set up, and I see some really weird stuff all the time that I can even stop. But you know, it's half of the stuff that's out there is just really noisy. And most endpoint protection mechanisms, whether it be Symantec or even antivirus, is going to see that noise and probably going to stop it depending on the function of this noise. So just a background of what portable executables are, because I want to set the stage of how this happened and how this particular type of attack happened. So a portable executable, if I could define it best, is a object code, a DLL, font files. These are things you commonly find in operating systems that are built in. These will show up in 32 and 64-bit versions of Windows operating systems. Now you'll find this in Linux too, but this is really more kind of geared towards Windows. And the PE format for data structure, this encapsulates all the information that's necessary for the OS to kind of do its thing for executable code. So if you're not familiar with DLL files, I know we have a lot of students in here, those are dynamic leak libraries. Those are normally shared files that the operating system will borrow, or different processes will borrow those files from in order to boot. Now, those are really, really hard sometimes. I wouldn't say really, really hard, but they're kind of protected in a nature of attacking. So if you're trying to compromise those DLLs in some cases, the anti-malware mechanisms, if you have good ones in your network, are going to block those. But that is really what a portable executable is. So when you're bringing in those, on a clean install, they're going to be there. Native tools, on the other hand, are things that are really built into the operating system upon install. Some of you all have heard of PowerShell. You probably have used PowerShell. PowerShell is considered to be a native utility in some operating systems. Things like EVTX viewers, event viewers, to view embedded log files in Windows, those are what we consider to be native programs. So these are things that are already there, and you've probably worked with them in Linux. If you've taken Linux courses before, you know that Linux has a lot of stuff built in that we can already use. Just for example, in Tom's presentation, he was using Lee's Discover script that's all built in shell scripts. So those shell scripts, you don't have to really add anything in, it just runs. So that's kind of the same direction that Windows uses with these native utilities. But we're finding, or at least I'm seeing in a lot of these newer styles of attacks, that we're not leveraging outside stuff like we used to. We're going and using more internal utilities, or we consider those native utilities like PowerShell, in order to fire off some of these newer exploit kits. So In an ideal attack scenario, think about this. The minimal number of these easily detectable portable executable installs coupled with the execution of these native tools. So like PowerShell, for example, this is really a quiet installation. You're not really adding a lot of stuff into the operating system. So if you're a hacker and you're thinking in terms of that and thinking, okay, well, if I can leverage what's already there and I can fly under the radar of antivirus, I'm going to be very hard to catch for a long period of time. And that's what we're seeing happen. So this kind of increases the likelihood of a successful attack. How are they doing this? So this kind of is spending all that time defining all this stuff. How are they achieving this? And there's some really interesting things. And one of the things I see pop up more and more and more are these potentially unwanted programs. We think that we got rid of these years ago, and we haven't even come close to this. If you start looking at the numbers and start looking at exactly how these things are firing away, we're not done with them yet. So a PUP, if I were to define it, it's basically something that the user perceives as unwanted, even if the user installed it themselves. A prime example of this is if you're installing one program, and if you've probably done this before, and you're racing through the install, and there's a little checkbox to say, oh, install this toolbar or install this program, and you just kind of race through it, and you click next, and then before you realize it, you have this second program that's installed on there, even though you opted to install that, that's considered to be a potentially unwanted application or a potentially unwanted program. There's really no clear opt-out method for a lot of these. This is why they propagate the way they do. Users know this. Hackers know this. And this usually comes in toolbars. Toolbars is probably the most well-known, infamous ones of these, and I'll have a case scenario where I break this down. And plugins are really, really bad about this, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff in there. This is the one that alarms me. In a 2014 study by Google, they found that these potentially unwanted programs, these portable executables basically, accounted for 24.7% of all malware infections. That's a quarter of all malware infections out there. This accounts for a quarter of them just by the numbers. And this is a particular Google study that they had put out there on just, breakdown of malware. So it's not a uncommon problem to see this happen. Now, just kind of a disclaimer, PUPs really aren't inherently malicious, but they can be. But they will increase an organization's attack surface, and they expose those systems to additional threats. Mainly what you're doing when you're adding these in, you don't know what you're adding in, number one, what's in the embedded code of these, and also you're adding in a program that gives that attacker something else to leverage, which we'll show here shortly. Now, these threats can extend well beyond software vulnerabilities. These can go into reverse shells. We can look at just different ways into the network in general. I'll show you how this is broke down. This is one that just came out last year, and you're seeing more and more of this in the mobile operating system. How many of you guys ever heard of Appflash? Probably not. Verizon signed this deal with a company called Appflash, or this EVIE, to basically incorporate a search bar into their versions of Android operating systems. Now, this is an outside, what I consider to be a PUP, but they're building it into Android OSs. Now, this is not embedded vanilla Android. This is added into the operating system by Verizon because of this agreement. The problem is with that, Verizon does not do the in-house development, nor does Android. So this is going to be a side-loaded app in here that we don't know. It's compromised. We have no idea. So what do you think that antivirus vendors are going to do when they see these programs natively built into Android? It's going to be like having the false credentials hanging around your neck. You look legit, you sound legit, you are legit, you're on a million gazillion devices out there. Have at it, Chief. We'll ignore basically any noisy installs that you might have in that operating system. And that's what's happening. That's just one example. Here's the case study, though, that I want to bring up, and I'll try to get through this relatively quick, and I think I can. So back in 2016, I'll give you a reason why this was placed onto my radar. So around probably January or February of this year, earlier, see, we're in 2018, January of 2017, so we're in April. So January of 2017, I got a call from a particular company, and this particular company was dealing with trying to scrub this particular type of ransomware off of their machines. Now, this particular firm was relatively big. It wasn't a small company by any means, but they really weren't dealing from an attack standpoint. They're just trying to figure out what exactly was happening in their network. They wanted to be able to retrace. So I asked the common questions. Are you collecting log files? Do you have web proxy logs? Do you have firewall logs? I'll take a look at your logs. I went through the logs and it was nothing. You know, everything looked legit. Looked at malware, anti-malware. Nothing. They had antivirus installed up to date on every one of their machines. Their operating systems were patched, but yet they were still getting bombarded with ransomware. It's like, wait a minute, you know, all the traditional attack vectors I'm looking for just aren't showing up. So what had happened, I noticed that there was when I started to look at polling the software that was installed on all these machines, I noticed that on all of the infected machines that they all had Askcom toolbars that were installed. It's like, oh, wait a minute. So it's like, well, I don't really like toolbars, and this doesn't give me warm, fuzzy feelings. So I started doing some research on it, and I found that there were a couple of little warning flags that kind of got raised up. And I contacted an individual who worked at Red Canary, who was a good friend of mine, and started talking to him about it. And he's like, yeah, you know, I have this right here. You know, I'll give you this information that I have. And it's great. It was everything that I was seeing happening in this network. And it all came back to this particular toolbar. So I'm like, okay, well, your antivirus should scan for and detect it and quarantine it and take it off. No. So it's like, this is the only bit of information that I can find on this. So basically, in November of that year, Red Canary had the same issue in one of their particular customers that they had in the network. And they had detected that the Ask.com toolbar had been compromised by a malicious actor, and then that malicious software had been propagated on the victim's endpoints. Nothing was detecting it. Now, if you're not familiar with Ask.com, this is kind of a variant of the Ask Jeeves, if you remember Ask Jeeves, for some of you guys that are older in the room. But Ask.com is basically like a cheap, poor man's version of Google, if you want to ask me. But one of the things they do is they kind of make their money off of advertisements. And they were bundling this with Oracle Java installers. So if you've installed Java over the past year, you probably remember that it bugged you to install this Ask.com toolbar. So, and I'll show you this here shortly. So if you installed Oracle probably between November or June of 2016 and possibly even up until this year, if you saved your executable, you could potentially be infected by this piece of malware. Not saying that you are, but you can be. So this is really one of the most pervasive unwanted software suites on the internet, in my opinion. So it's really heavily used. And this particular organization that I was scanning or doing the work for actually required their users to install it because they were using it to do open source searches against particular other clients. Don't know why they would require that, but this was just one of the things they did on a low number of machines, and they just kept blowing out the same image, so it just kept getting infected over and over and over again. So 1 month later, this is after the Red Canary article dropped, and there's a link up there, and I'll be more than happy to pass this off to you guys if you ever want this PowerPoint. Carbon Black, and I worked with some folks and actually talked to them. You guys are probably familiar with, I know Bill knows Brian Baskin. He worked for him. He was part of this particular research. And a girl that I had met at a B-Sides conference, Sarah Miller, who now works for FireEye, I believe. She was involved in this as well. They had the same issue, and they had customers who were getting infected by this, did not know how to stop it, did not know how to get rid of it, just had this random outbreak of ransomware, basically, reverse shells. And this was a month after the Carbon Black, or after the Red Canary incident. So here's the questions I want to answer here. The 4 that I want to go through is, how did this exploit work? And the second one, how did the exploit go undetected for weeks, if not a year at best? From a digital forensics and incident response perspective, how do you identify these types of threats? And there's some really interesting results I got out of this. And from an InfoSec perspective, how do we mitigate and prevent these types of attacks in the future? Well, here's the first question. How did this exploit work? So when the Java installer was installing, or in general, if you went out to Askcom, there was an executable that you would download as part of this particular software package, and it was entitled apnmcp.exe. Very simple, innocuous file, right? Executables are always innocuous. So this was a component of the APN, what they called the update process. So once that executable fired and it started its install, what it would do is it would connect to a tbapi.search.ask.com, which still kind of functions within the ask.com domain. So we're still safe and good to go there. It immediately made an outbound connection via a valid digitally signed certificate. So a digitally signed certificate file called logo.png or logo.gif. Sounds totally legit from there, right? Because you never get infected by GIF images or ping images, right? And in some variants, you would see one or the other. So I got a hold of about 2 or 3 of these executables, and I noticed they flip-flop back and forth between these. Anyone that InfoSec can tell you, you can embed a lot of malicious code inside a ping image or a GIF image. Right, Bill? Yes. Yeah, so absolutely. You probably saw that little dancing Android man back earlier in the presentation. That's laden with malware, by the way. So just to give you an FYI, I have a couple of really interesting pieces in there, but nothing that would scrub a machine. But anyway, or hose a machine, I guess you would say. But when it redirected, what the ping image would do is it would redirect to an outside VPN server, or not a VPN server, a VPS server outside the US that was not associated with the APN environment. So even though it was saying that it was in the US, it was not a US-based server. It then, once it redirected to this APN update manager.exe. It was a remote access Trojan. So this is a second stage Trojan that would download and install itself, and then that was also signed by the APN LLC code signing certificate issued November 9th of 2016. Now let's do some timeline here. When did Red Canary identify that this was a potential threat? November what, 2016? November 5th, right? Now, Carbon Black said that this was happening in December. Note that the date that I have there was signed with an APN LLC certificate that was issued on November 9th of 2016. So this was an active threat even after Red Canary got a hold of this. And when Carbon Black published their article, this was still happening. This still is happening today. This is not something that's been totally mitigated yet. And I'll give you the reasons why that's the case. So in that update manager, what basically happened was a second stage remote access Trojan would install. It would enumerate processes to give the user a reverse shell. That user would then use that reverse shell to run a number of other scripts which would scalp all the users off, automatically create user accounts on the access machine that executable just gave the remote access to, and then start to enumerate different information off of those machines without no intervention of the user whatsoever. So let's say you're running on a Windows machine, to just kind of bring this into perspective. This particular program fires, it goes through its Java installer. Now you have a reverse shell that starts to scalp stuff out of your registry. It takes it out of your temporary internet files, anything that might potentially have harvested credit card information, user accounts, and then it starts to look at that information and say, what kind of server am I dealing with here? Is this a DNS server? Is this a DHCP server? Is this, Windows servers run on everything? Is it a credit card server? What kind of databases am I up against? And then we would go through and hand parse those, and who knows what we'll find from there. So that's on the other end of that. I'm going to break this down. So stop for a second. How did that exploit work again? So when it made that outbound HTTP connection to the same host, it responded that reverse command shell. We just talked about that. Said everything, stolen credentials, other persistent mechanisms. Once I'm in, I'm in. Okay? And if no one's stopping me, I'm going to continue to be in on that machine and harvest stuff out for months, if not years on end. This is like if you've seen that movie Beautiful Mind, where you have John Nash there. He finds that perfect code and he's cracking the Russian codes and then he finds out he's crazy. This is kind of what I call beautiful malware because nothing is detecting it. No one knows that they're being infected. They think they installed something that's stupid like an Askcom toolbar that they never use, but no one really knows they're being infected. Now this is an interesting thing, and I'll break that down. You guys in the 90s, anybody born in the 90s will get that reference, right? I love that. It's funnier in my head. Like that's the first thing I thought of when I was like, let's break it down. You know what I'm talking about. Bill, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes, I'm old.
Yeah, you were in the clubs then. This is why Bill's knees are wore out, because he did that dance right there. That's why MC Hammer limps around too. So let's look at this. So you have that mcp.exe, that first file that I was talking about. That is considered to be a portable execution file by Windows. It's signed, it's sealed, and it's delivered. Nothing's picking it up. That malicious process made an outbound HTTP connection to the same host. It spawned a reverse command shell. Now over on the right over there in the gray, you see that process allowed the installation of a batch file with encoded native PowerShell commands. Okay, the word native pops up there. It runs those commands in the registry and runs those keys as a persistent mechanism. Now, do you see it? You see the two ingredients here that's part of that potential attack that shows and brings up every red flag. We have a PE file, and we have also leveraging what? Native utilities, right? So you have those two ingredients that you don't have to bring in outside stuff. This is not a very noisy attack, believe it or not. It sounds like it. And that's mainly because Windows just kind of looks at it and ignores it. They're just kind of laying on it and sleepy. Yes, sir?
Most PE executables would be by antivirus. Is there an existing signature, or did the AIDE vendors just basically drop the ball on this?
Yeah, so hold after the commercial break there, and I'll give you the cliffhanger on this one. Because that's what I thought when I was looking at it. I thought, why aren't the AV clients picking this up? Why is this, if this doesn't have a valid digital signature, or if they're spoofing the signature, why is it not picking this up? Why does it just scrub it off? So here's a random meme break. There's another cool one there. Like that one. We're on a college campus, so this one's totally relevant. So, how did it go undetected? This answers Bill's question here. So most Windows applications that have specific extensions other than EXE will have binaries that will be digitally signed. Even executables will be digitally signed that come from a server. That's kind of, and to give a background of what digital signatures are, this is kind of like signing their name to a certificate signing authority. So we call them CA root certificates in certain cases. So a certificate authority like Symantec will sign that file and say, yes, this file came from Ask.com. The hash value says that it came from Ask.com. It has all the heuristics that on all the keys that it smells and looks like and acts like that it's from a legit server. So the three things that PE binaries look for or at least antivirus vendors in most cases, or any endpoint vendors, is first one, is it signed? So does it have a digital signing entity? Is it present in other environments? kind of like the scientific method. If everyone else in the scientific community is using it, normally it's generally accepted in the scientific community, right? And the frequency. Are these binaries present in other environments? So are they normally present, and how often are they present? Those are three things that vendors look for. Now, let's look at the digital signature. So I ran this digital signature of this particular file. So was the binary written or executed by a digitally signed entity? Well, is it? Yeah, apn.llc, so Ask Networks, was signed by Symantec on November 9th, 2016 with a valid thumbprint serial number, and it was valid to May 28th of 2018. So this is still a valid certificate unless they revoke the certificate, which I'm hoping they did. I haven't checked it lately. Are the binaries present in other environments? If it's part of a Java install, is that present in other environments? Absolutely, we know that. Is it frequent? Well, look at the Firefox add-ons. Yeah, people install it all the time, believe it or not. Firefox has it as an add-on. There's a demo toolbar that's part of another installer there. And then there on the right, there's another installer that builds it in. So you see this all the time. It's present in other environments. It passes the sniff test. Now let's break down the certificate authority here. Now, what do you notice odd about this certificate signing authority? So let's do a little timeline analysis here. See anything weird about it?
Yeah, date.
Yeah, when was it valid from? Remember the dates. Remember that November 9th date that I showed to you when it was first detected? It has a signed certificate that started back in November 9th of 2016. Now, this is something that's interesting here because if a certificate has been signed recently, this is not something that's not abnormal by any means. You're going to find CA authorities that will sign certificates that will go back a week, a month, or even a couple of months. That's not totally abnormal to see something like that. But this is something that piqued my interest. I thought, okay, if I'm looking at this in January and this was just signed on November 9th of 2016, this is just 2 months ago, that's going to pique my interest. Antivirus is going to say, this is signed, this is good to go. It doesn't look at the actual time that it was signed. So there's another thing that you can look for there. Something just doesn't look right. So if you're examining these PE files and you think something looks real rotten with them, look at the certificate signing authority and see when it was signed. And if it was signed fairly recently, you might be dealing with some troublesome files. So this was not revoked just yet. So then I took the exe file and I deconstructed it. What do you notice about the deconstructed file right away? Let's look at the header of it. What's the header have in it? It has an outbound what? With an outbound IP address that goes out to a 221 or 4576.221.212. If you did a whois search on it at that time, this would come back to a particular, I'll just show you exactly if I can get back out of this here and what this looked like. So if I just go out and do a whois search, and I tried a whois here and it wouldn't let me through, but normally under normal circumstances you could do a whois search, and basically that came back to a VPS that ran on a particular network that was notorious about serving out and harboring and holding malware. So just a quick internet search, it came out to be, I can't remember, it was a company out of New Jersey. Carbon Black talks a little bit about it, but I don't know exactly what the name of the company is. But that just, you could do a search of that particular IP address, and I guarantee that you would find some interesting results out of it. If it goes back to a VPS, it's probably not legit. And if it's not within Ask.com's network, yeah, it's not going to look right, period. So the next thing that we're looking at there, after that, is down there towards the bottom. There's some stuff around the bottom. Anybody recognize any of that stuff at the bottom? I don't know if I can zoom in on it, but try. I can't really zoom in on it. You see you see that that .pdb? Anybody tell me what a PDB is? Have you ever seen that kind of stuff in there? It's got some Apache stuff in it. Probably not something you're going to see from an executable that is supposedly attributed to Askcom. So if you see anything weird like that, that might raise some red flags as well. And you're seeing some stuff even in that Apache that goes back to 11/24 of 2016, which shouldn't be part of that certificate authority. So really that's throwing some more red flags for me. Not per se that you'll never find that there, but it's certainly in there. Now, just for the grins and giggles of it, I decided when I got up this morning, I said, I'm going to run that apn.exe again. And I ran it through a VirusTotal, and you can see that I'm not lying about this. I ran the analysis on April 5th, 2018. Look what the detection ratio is of this as of this morning. I don't get warm and fuzzy feelings when 19 of your 67 anti-malware clients do not pick this up. And this happened in November of 2016. This is still persistent. This is still out there. Now, the thing is still there. That's not a good sign. Now, that's not to say that they haven't scrubbed this or has not fixed this yet, but you'll still see a lot of people that will pull down certain Java installs that has this embedded in. They'll save them onto file share servers. They'll propagate them or reinstall them, or they'll include them in with images, and these things just keep getting propagated over and over and over again, and the anti-malware clients aren't picking it up. Now, the fourth question that you have there is, how do we mitigate this, and how do we prevent these types of attacks in the future? Well, first, the easy way to say just avoid all third-party plugins and extensions. That's the easy answer to that. How realistic is that, though? It's not realistic in the real world. Especially here in academia, where a lot of folks will say we need to install everything, anything, and all things because we're an academic institution. You're fettering, inhibiting our ability to do valid research because you're blocking something. And that's honestly what they think. So it's not always the best way to do that. It is a practice. It is something, and I know that like School of Medicine, for example, for a long time, had a WebSense proxy in there, and they just blocked the executables from being downloaded. It's not realistic, but it's another thing where you're dealing with an environment that if you're doing something like that, what are the users going to do if you're blocking executable downloads? What's common sense going to tell you? Did it when I was adminning network. If I can't download an executable file, what's going to happen? I'm going to get it from somewhere else, and I'm going to transfer it over, and I'm going to install it, because the web proxy is not going to keep me from installing it. It'll keep me from downloading it. So now I'm bringing in older versions of software. I'm propagating that back into the network again. So that's not always the best way. And none of these payloads were detected by endpoint engines at the time of execution. And only a few, I think when I checked it in January, only 3 covered it, and now only 19 of 67 anti-malware covers this. So we're still not quite there yet. So it's still a problem. Now, the plugins, the extensions alone is not sufficient to detect any new novel attack. You're really breaking these files down. Look at the behaviors of those files to specific applications. Don't go with the "it's not harming me today" verbiage. Okay, that's what a lot of people take. And another thing with this, don't over-technificate it. You see a lot of stuff where people talk about APTs. Sometimes APTs aren't necessarily that advanced. They're adequate persistent threats, because a hacker sometimes will fire off exploits they don't even know how they even interact. or how they function on a machine. They just know that they work and they push them out. I've seen that a lot in a lot of cases where worked with a lot of clients, and people will send me a lot of stuff to look at. And one of the things I see, they'll just do some easy stuff. They'll exfiltrate data from an FTP server. Still to this day, they do that. They'll map drives through SMB. You probably say, well, what's SMB? SMB, for some students in here, you're probably familiar with it with your network map V drives at the university. It's mapped network drives. So if you can map a drive to an outside entity, harvest the data, pull it out, or you can run a script to put it out to pastebin. You can do something along those lines. Now, the very end of this is one of the things where you're looking at something, and everyone, when they look at malware, they kind of say, okay, you have to catch something with a hook, right? You have to hook somebody in some way. That's not necessarily the case, because in this particular case, you just had a very innocuous software program that's installed and masked itself as a legitimate install, and it still stayed persistent in the network. Now, from everything I can figure out, these persistent means only lasted about 6 or 8 months before they started to get locked out by the major vendors like Symantec. Ask eventually came out and said, and I talked to some folks at both Red Canary and Carbon Black who had some insider knowledge, that said that these persistent mechanisms Ask was infected around June of that year. So they didn't pick it up until November. So June, July, August, September, October, November. 6 months before it got found. Okay? I took this to B-Sides in May of last year when only about 3 antivirus vendors picked up on it. So you had another 6 months. Think about, as an attacker, if you can have a persistent mechanism that gave you unfettered reverse shell access into a network for roughly a year, you'd be happy. You guys are in Bill, Tom, you guys know, Adrian. If you had access to a machine for a year, you'd be totally happy with that, right? I mean, it's a monster report. So how did this all happen? This is one thing I never talked about. How did all this happen? Well, was it because the attacker attacked a particular user's machine? How did they get all of this to propagate? I left the kind of cliffhanger part of this out. So where did the sole source of this begin? Can you figure it out? It's kind of like the, have you ever seen that movie, The Machinist, with Christian Bale in it? You watch that movie, you have no idea that movie's going to end like it does. Totally just like, boom, like, whoa, I didn't expect that. Saw all the signs there that something weird was going on, but I did not expect it to end like that. Especially like this. Attackers had literally compromised Ask.com server, had loaded the malicious content into Ask.com server they had compromised. Ask had totally submitted those executables and binaries to be signed by Symantec, and Symantec says, well, you must keep them safe. This must be true, so we're going to sign them for you anyway. So this was hacked at the very top source. Do you see more and more of this happen? Absolutely. We're seeing that through Equifax. You're seeing it through a lot of top-level domains. Why are attackers going after top-level domains? Why are they going after these heavy actors rather than trying to funnel around the bottom? If I can attack the top, it's like Reagan's trickle-down economy. We're going to trickle down to the smaller machines. If we catch those, the machines that they trickle down to, it's going to take a long time to scrub the persistence off of those machines because we're not really even sure what happened there. And this could be a network forensics nightmare, at least on my end, because all the automated means just aren't picking it up. So you're going to see more and more of this, and it's going to continue to happen. Yes, Bill?
So this is a Windows-only infection.
This one is, because it was an executable .exe.
So the defense against this is to buy Macs.
Buy Macs or use Linux. No, I mean, this is crazy. this is crazy because, and this scared the bejesus out of me because, you're always looking for like, fired exploits to be looking, and to think that this got embedded into an executable and it flew under the radar of all the controls that we have in the network, it's really, really scary. Now, this is why we need folks sitting behind white hats looking at these networks, because some of these heuristic and automated means just aren't going to detect it. Still don't detect it to this day. And those folks you have to be agile on your feet. And what happened is, the only reason that this got caught is because Red Canary and Carbon Black had customers that said, whoa, wait a minute, I can't stop this. Can you figure this out for me? And they did. And that's really what stopped it. It's just some good old-fashioned elbow grease, honestly, that stopped it. So for you guys looking out here, it's good job security. These kind of things, you don't want to see this happen to your network, but it's not advanced in most cases. Don't over technify it, or I'm trying to get that word spread out there. Technificate. Don't over technificate these things. If you see it and it has a sense, this is what threat hunting is kind of morphing into. This is kind of a scratch the surface of threat hunting, but going back and saying, okay, did this happen in my network over the past year? Then you can start to say, okay, if this executable compromised, then I can go back and look at my logs and say, okay, when did it compromise? Why is it continuing to compromise? And then when I went back and looked at the network, the logs and the proxy logs they were running, they had a proxy log. The proxy logs made sense. The log files made sense, and I could go back and look at specific times that these machines basically got hosed. And then I could go back to the system admin and say, hey, this is when the machine got hosed, and this is what it hosed. Luckily, they had backups to go back to, but it was pretty nasty to scrub these off of machines. Guys, have any questions? Contact information's there. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. Follow all three of those accounts. MU Gen Cyber account is our high school camp that we do for the high school kids every year. We're doing it in July this year. So if you know of anyone, we're trying to saturate like the southern rural counties of the state. So if you know of any folks that are in those areas that you can share this with, feel free to share it with them. We want to get those applications. They're due May 18th. So if we could saturate those areas with applications, feel free to share any posts that go out. Let folks know that this camp is available, because we want to get these folks to college. We want to train them and eventually turn them into good employees one of these days. And this is the kind of stuff we cover with them at a very basic level. These things. No questions, put you to sleep, right? I did it.